Hello, everyone. I met Mr. Walter Russell Mead at a dinner party in Washington. He's a prolific author and a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, a very astute commentator on foreign affairs. I'm talking to him today about the situation, the international situation in the world as experienced by the United States and its Western allies, let's say. We're going to talk about Russia and China and Iran and Israel and Palestine, all the, what would you call it, predictable villains. And so Mr. Walter Russell Mead is a writer, professor, and academic focusing his efforts, as I said, on international policy and foreign affairs. He is the James Clark Chase Professor of Foreign Affairs and Humanities at Bard College and taught U.S. foreign policy at Yale. Mead has worked as a columnist for publications such as the Wall Street Journal and was editor-at-large for the American Interest. His books include Mortal Splendor, Special Providence, Power, Terror, Peace, and War, God and Gold, and most recently, 2022, The Ark of a Covenant. So, Mr. Mead, you've spent an awful lot of time thinking about foreign policy in very many different aspects, not concentrating necessarily on any particular part of the world, but taking as much as it's possible a relatively global view. And so maybe we could start our discussion by having you summarize what you think are the most important issues that confronted the United States and the Western world more generally on the foreign relations front in 2022. And maybe we can also talk about what you see happening in 2023 as we move forward. What's currently besetting us in the West on the foreign policy front?
Well, this is a really difficult time. It's important maybe to help people get what's happening in the world is to realize sort of what the basic framework of world politics is. And that is that beginning about 300 years ago, the British began to build this sort of global commercial order where there's trade, there's commerce, and the British also were concerned for creating balance of power in Europe and developing their power globally so that this commercial maritime system would develop. The Americans more or less inherited, or some would say took over that system at the end of World War II. And this liberal international maritime commercial system of trade, of power, of political relationships is the dominant reality in world politics. And the world is more or less divided between countries that are fairly happy with this system and would like to see it continue, countries who have some grievances, would like the system adjusted, but are basically willing to work within that system, and then countries who want to bring the whole thing down. And today, the leading countries that are in that are China, Russia, and Iran, along with certain smaller hangers-on like Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and a few others. And we've seen since, at the end of the Cold War, 1990, it looked as if this Anglo-American system would last forever. People talked about the end of history. But partly because countries like China have developed and become more powerful, but maybe more fundamentally because the Americans and our close allies have not done a very good job of understanding how to build and nurture and maintain this system, we've seen gradually a kind of a crisis of opposition approaching. And 2022, between the Russian invasion of Ukraine, China's continued sort of menacing of Taiwan, and Iran's refusal to rejoin the JCPOA, its deepening alliance with Russia, we've seen this alliance of revisionist powers assemble themselves for a real challenge to this international system.
Well, so maybe we could walk through each of those countries in turn. I mean, the first reaction I have to what you said is that, say what you might about the Anglo-American sphere of influence, it's by no means self-evident that either China, Russia, or Iran stand out as shining moral lights to emulate as an alternative. I mean, China is a desperately terrible totalitarian communist state. Iran is basically an Islamo-fascist regime. And well, Russia seems to be the outlier to some degree, but, because at least nominally it could be allied with the West, but it's certainly proved extremely problematic in new ways since the end of the Cold War. So, I mean, on what grounds can countries like China and Iran, for example, offer anything even remotely like an alternative to the sphere of Anglo-American domination? Let's start with China.
Right. Well, China offers what China offers countries, or at least did offer, because its offering has gotten less attractive between the mounting totalitarianism, the economic trouble that they're in, and the reaction to COVID. They were saying, look, you don't have to buy the Western package in order to become rich and powerful. And furthermore, they were saying to somebody like the ruler of a country like Zimbabwe or other countries, we'll give you money, we'll give you tech. We won't ask you any questions about how much money your brother-in-law is making out of the deal. No pesky auditors. We will, we're not like the Anglo-Americans. We won't try to make you behave. We'll we'll empower you to do exactly as you like. Now, that is not a positive agenda for an alternative world order, but it is an offer that a lot of governments or a lot of powerful individuals might find attractive.
Yeah, powerful and corrupt individuals. I mean, so let's take that apart a little bit. So the first part of that is the proposition that you can actually be wealthy, or let's say have abundant resources and a reasonable standard of living for your citizens, not for you, without adopting something like the underlying metaphysics of the Western moral code.
Yep.
And that proposition strikes me as highly improbable, given that the only reason that China is rich at all is because it managed to integrate itself with the West and essentially adopt quasi-capitalist principles without actually adopting the underlying metaphysic. And I don't think their system is stable. I don't think they're going to be able to propagate that well-being into the future. I mean, you said yourself that China has tilted very heavily under Xi towards an increasing totalitarianism, and that's pretty much self-evident. And the fact that they can only peddle their wares with regards to, what would you say, their profitability on the dictator front to corrupt governments also indicates the moral bankruptcy of their offerings. So if what China has to offer is the ability to bring together, the corrupt